Son, I want you to marry Chidimma Okoro. Her parents were the hands that pulled me from the jaws of death when I had nothing. Son, they may live simply, but they possess a dignity that money cannot manufacture. They have a depth of character you have never known. A village girl, Dad? You're asking me to gamble my reputation on someone from the rural interior? A complete stranger?
Me, Julian Adeyemi, the most envied man in Lagos, the king of the tech sector, forced into a marriage with someone who has never seen a skyscraper. Fine, I'll go through with this charade to secure my inheritance, but I'll make sure she learns that in my world, she is nothing more than an ornament. The old adage suggests that you shouldn't test the depth of a river with both feet, yet it's equally true that one shouldn't assume the quality of a person by the dust on their shoes. Julian Adeyemi never bothered with such thoughts. To him, the world was a balance sheet. Success was measured in market share and influence, and anyone who didn't contribute to that bottom line was essentially invisible. When his father laid out his final ironclad demand, a union with the daughter of the couple who had nursed him back to health decades ago, Julian's initial reaction was pure, cold rage. But the threat of losing his family's massive conglomerate was enough to force his hand. He agreed, harboring a dark plan. The marriage would be a hollow contract, a necessary sacrifice to keep the empire intact, while he ensured his bride felt the full weight of her inferior status every single day. He had no idea that the woman he was about to bring into his world was the only person capable of holding up the crumbling foundations of his own life.
20 years prior, the landscape was different. A younger Chief Adeyemi was a man defined by ego, speeding through the dangerous backroads of the East. A catastrophic crash left him mangled and abandoned, his own inner circle already plotting to carve up his assets. He was rescued not by a business associate, but by a local herbalist and her husband. For months, they transformed their modest hut into a sanctuary. With nothing but the medicinal knowledge passed down through generations of their ancestors, they set his bones and coaxed his life back into his body. While convalescing, the chief saw a life that challenged his entire worldview. These people had no electricity, no internet, and no bank accounts, yet they displayed a level of integrity he'd never seen in the high-stakes boardrooms of Victoria Island. When he finally walked away, he carried a vow. His lineage would be tied to theirs. He wanted his son to inherit more than just cash and equity. He wanted him to inherit the moral compass he lacked.
The call from the family estate regarding his father's health collapse felt like a jarring blow. Since the death of his mother, his father was the only person Julian truly valued, and the news sent him speeding to the mansion through the heavy Lagos rain. Inside the grand estate, the sight of his father, once an iron-willed patriarch, now pale and tethered to monitors, drained the color from Julian's face. He stood by the bed, his usual professional shield lowered, genuinely shaken by the frailty of the man who had been his entire world. "You came," his father whispered, his breath shallow. "I'm here, Dad. You need to rest," Julian said, his voice unusually strained. But his father shook his head slowly. "Find Chidima," his father whispered, clinging to his last breaths. "Marry her. Bring the humility of her home into these halls, or I will ensure the board of directors strips you of everything." Julian stared at his father, his eyes as blank as a computer screen. He didn't see an opportunity for growth. He saw a logistical nightmare. To Julian, his father's obsession with a virtuous bride was a relic of a dying generation, a foolish sentiment that had no place in his world of data and power. He failed to grasp the truth of the old wisdom. What an elder sees while sitting down, a young man cannot see, even if he climbs the tallest tree.
He didn't want this marriage, but for the sake of his father's final peace, he found himself trapped. He would go to the interior. He would bring this girl to Lagos. But in his grief, he decided that if he was forced to endure this, she would have to pay the price. He planned to use her, humiliate her, and constantly remind her that she came from a simple, rural village, while he belonged to a world of prestige, wealth, and power. But Julian was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, because the quiet village girl he looked down on was far more intelligent, stronger, and more important than he could ever imagine. And when the people he trusted most eventually betrayed him, she would become the only person willing to stand by his side.
She would save his business, expose a shocking conspiracy, heal the wounds he had carried for years, and completely change the man he had become.
3 days after his father's health took a sharp turn, Julian Adeyemi sat in the back of a black Mercedes SUV as it peeled away from the manicured streets of Victoria Island. The sleek towers and high-end traffic of Lagos slowly thinned out, replaced by the sprawling, rugged landscapes of the east. Julian checked his tablet, his thumb hovering over emails about a critical server upgrade, but his focus was shattered. Everything about this journey offended his sense of order. The winding, uneven roads, the roadside markets buzzing with vendors, and the relentless heat. It all felt like a descent into a forgotten world. Beside him sat Mr. Adebayo, his father's long-time legal counsel and executor of the estate, who kept his gaze fixed on a folder of documents. "We're about 2 hours from the village, sir," Adebayo noted quietly. Julian looked out the window, his jaw set in a hard line. He checked his watch, a piece of engineering worth more than the village he was headed toward. He had already decided how this would play out. He would make the formal offer, bring the girl back to Lagos, and stow her away in one of his secondary properties. She would be an invisible ghost in his life, a means to an end, nothing more. He hadn't come for a wife. He had come to claim the signature that would unlock his inheritance.
As the SUV transitioned from the main highway onto the narrow, red-earthed roads of the interior, the lush greenery seemed to press against the glass. The city's cold, metallic rhythm felt light years away. When the car finally slowed, rolling into the quiet settlement surrounded by towering palm trees and humble mud brick houses, a group of children scattered, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of the gleaming vehicle. Julian stepped out. His Italian leather shoes immediately met the fine red dust of the village, and he brushed it off with a look of visible disdain. He adjusted his suit jacket, his presence alone silencing the area. The villagers stopped their chores, whispering and pointing at the man who looked like he had stepped out of a magazine and into their reality. Not far from the village square, Chidimma Okoro was returning from the stream. She walked with a steady, graceful stride, balancing a container of water on her head with the ease of someone who had never known the convenience of a tap. She was 25, with a sharp intelligence in her eyes and a natural, unadorned beauty that required no artifice. She wore a simple, traditional wrapper, her skin glowing with a warmth that felt entirely at odds with the sterile, air-conditioned life Julian had left behind in Lagos.
As she drew closer to her family's home, she saw the dark, expensive SUV parked under the ancient mango tree. The villagers were gathered, murmuring in confusion. Julian stepped forward, his dark sunglasses hiding his eyes, his posture rigid. Mr. Adebayo stepped forward, bowing his head respectfully toward her. "Are you Chidimma Okoro?" Chidimma paused, her expression composed and curious. She nodded slowly. Julian pulled off his sunglasses, his gaze scanning her, from her simple attire to the way she held herself. He expected to see a girl desperate for a way out, someone who would be dazzled by his presence. Instead, he saw a quiet, steady strength that he didn't quite know how to categorize. He didn't offer a polite greeting. His pride, the only armor he had left, took control.
He looked at her with a cold, detached indifference and said, "So you're the girl my father's will is so concerned with." The air around them grew heavy. Before the village elders could voice their outrage, Chidimma's uncle Oke pushed his way to the front, his smile sycophantic. "We are honored, sir. We accept the proposal. We accept everything." He saw Julian not as a man, but as a walking vault, and he was ready to sell his niece to the sharks if it meant securing a seat at the table of the Lagos elite. Chidimma shot her uncle a look of sharp disbelief before turning her eyes back to Julian. She met his cold stare head-on and replied in a voice as calm as a still lake, "And I suppose you're the man who thinks his status is the only thing that defines him?"
Julian was stunned. He had expected submission. He had been met with iron. Before the tension could shatter, Mr. Adebayo stepped forward, holding the tablet. "Chief Adeyemi wanted you to see this personally, Miss Chidima." The screen flickered to life. The chief lay in a hospital bed, looking ghostly and frail. "Chidima," his voice was a ragged whisper, "I know my son is difficult. I know he lacks the humility I once learned from your mother. But he is lost, and I am running out of time. I do not ask you to marry him for money. I ask you to marry him to save the only thing I have left, his humanity. If you do this, you will be the daughter I never had." Chidima looked at the video, then at Julian, who stood there looking at his watch as if he were waiting for a service to end. She saw the arrogance in him, but she also saw the reflection of the lonely, broken man his father was terrified he would become. "I will do it," Chidima said. "But not for you, Julian, and certainly not for my uncle. I will do it because your father deserves to see that the kindness my mother once showed him was not wasted."
2 days later, the chaotic, high-speed energy of Lagos engulfed Chidima. She was driven straight to the Adeyemi estate, a massive, cold structure that felt more like a fortress than a home. While Julian stayed in his office to handle the fallout of the announcement, Mr. Adebayo led Chidima to the master wing. The room was heavy with the scent of antiseptics and fading life. Chief Adeyemi lay propped against pillows, his eyes closed, his breathing labored. As Chidima entered, the chief's eyelids fluttered open. He looked at her, and for the first time in months, the pain in his expression softened into relief. "You came," he whispered. Chidima didn't hesitate. She walked to the bedside and took the old man's hand. It was thin, cold, and trembling. She looked at the expensive, sophisticated medical equipment surrounding the bed, then at the chief, and finally back to the doorway where Julian stood, watching with a mixture of confusion and detachment. "I am here, Chief," she said firmly. She leaned over and began to adjust the pillows, her movements practiced and gentle, the way her mother had taught her. A week passed, and the luxury of the Lagos mansion felt like a cage to Chidima, but her focus remained fixed on the master bedroom. While Julian spent his days in boardrooms, calculating how to secure his inheritance, Chidima spent her days at the chief's bedside. She acted like a daughter, applying the traditional herbal remedies her mother had once used to save his life. One evening, Julian walked in to find his father laughing, a sound he hadn't heard in years. For a brief moment, the ice in his heart cracked. He saw his father at peace, comforted by a girl who didn't want his money, but simply wanted to care for his soul. The chief grabbed Chidima's hand and placed it in Julian's. "She is the best thing you will ever have, Julian. Do not lose her." But death does not wait for a change of heart. 2 days later, the machines fell silent. As the estate fell into the quiet gloom of mourning, the funeral was a massive, hollow display of wealth. Julian stood at the head of the grave, looking more untouchable than ever. But as the crowd dispersed, a switch flipped. The man who had been humbled by his father's passing was gone. In his place stood the billionaire, looking at Chidima with eyes that had turned cold and predatory once more. The debt was paid,
The inheritance was his. That night, back in the mansion, the living hell began. Julian entered her room, not as a grieving son, but as a man who had finally regained his crown. "The show is over, Chidima," he said, his voice sharp as a blade. "My father is buried, and you have served your purpose. From tomorrow, you will learn exactly what it means to be a village girl in a house that doesn't want you."
A month after the funeral, the memorial service served as the stage for Julian's first public strike. The garden of the mansion was filled with the cream of Lagos society. Julian stood at the center of a group of elite investors, swirling his drink. When a senator's wife asked how they met, Julian smirked, looking towards Chidima before replying loudly. "My father had a flair for the dramatic," he said. "He found her in the interior and insisted on the union. It's an interesting experience, having a bit of the village at the dinner table." Laughter rippled through the group. Before the sting could settle, Vanessa, his ex-girlfriend, walked up to Chidima, scanning her from head to toe with a sneer. "It's a pity, really," Vanessa whispered, loud enough for the nearby socialites to overhear. "They say behind every great man is a great woman. But in your case, it seems you're just the wallpaper. Does the silence of the village bore you, or are you just here to collect your allowance?" The surrounding women giggled. Chidima didn't look down. She turned slowly, her gaze calm and piercing, and held Vanessa's eyes with a chilling, quiet poise.
"Vanessa, is it?" Chidima began, her voice low but clear enough to cut through the chatter. "It is interesting that you speak of great men and wallpaper. You define your worth by the man standing next to you, which explains why you're so comfortable being a footnote in Julian's history. You treat life like a gallery where you're desperate to be hung on the wall. I, however, have no need to decorate a room I don't intend to stay in." The laughter died instantly. Vanessa's face turned pale. Chidima leaned in slightly. "You've spent years trying to be the most expensive ornament in Julian's collection. It must be exhausting, knowing that a woman who doesn't belong can see right through your polish to the insecurity underneath. Perhaps you should find a hobby that doesn't involve counting my husband's shadows." Chidima turned away, leaving the elite stunned. Julian, watching from a distance, went rigid. The amusement vanished from his face, replaced by a dark, simmering realization. He had brought a storm into his house.
Later, in a board meeting, Chidima sat in the corner. As Julian stepped out, she watched the CFO, Mr. Benson, pass a folded note to the head of operations. Their eyes locked in a look of cold, predatory calculation. Chidima didn't know the specifics, but she knew the look of a vulture. As they drove home, Julian didn't speak. He was already planning the next event where he could make her feel small. He was so busy trying to bury the village girl that he had no idea he was standing on a trapdoor. She had come to this city to honor a promise, but as she looked at Julian's profile, she realized her purpose had changed. He was sinking his own empire, and the village girl he had brought to be his trophy was now the only one who held the map to his survival. The game had only just begun.